The singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell has said she'll remove her music from the streaming service Spotify in a row about coronavirus misinformation on a podcast. In a statement on her website, she said she stood in solidarity with Neil Young, who withdrew his music this week and warned lies were costing people their lives. Joe Rogan, whose podcast appears exclusively on Spotify, has been criticised for interviewing an infectious disease specialist who is critical of COVID vaccines. Well, the music industry expert Chris Cook explained why Spotify is likely to choose Joe Rogan over big-name artists.
Spotify spent a lot of money to get their relationship with Joe Rogan going. So obviously, I think Spotify is still probably best known as a music streaming service, but for a number of years now have been really trying to push into the podcast market. And one of the ways they did that was by signing up podcast superstars like Joe Rogan. And so, yes, certainly to remove Joe Rogan never seemed like that was going to happen. Whether behind the scenes any conversations are going on about the future of what happens on his program, obviously we don't know. But yes, it seemed unlikely, and I'm pretty sure Neil Young did not expect them to pick his music over the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah, nonetheless, how much do you think his intervention, and now Joni Mitchell backing up Neil Young, how much do you think that intervention is going to put pressure on Spotify to do exactly what you were talking about, perhaps have discussions behind the scenes about the content of some of those podcasts?
Well, I suppose as part of a bigger picture, lots of digital platforms are facing similar challenges, both from their users and from their advertisers, and indeed from lawmakers. The conversation about these platforms that have so much content and pretty much allow anybody to publish, I mean, anyone can have a podcast on Spotify, more or less, are under pressure to deal with what is sometimes termed harmful content, which would include misleading content, misleading information. What do the platforms do? And obviously there's always that freedom of expression, free speech side to this. These platforms don't want to be seen to be censoring their audience. Although I suppose on Spotify, the Joe Rogan experience is different to the many thousands of other podcasts on there, in that they are more directly involved in that program. They exclusively license it. So I think there are two sides here, which is what does Spotify do behind the scenes with Joe Rogan? Would Joe Rogan be open to having a little bit more editorial guidance on his program? Possibly not. But there's also, whatever they do with the Joe Rogan podcast, are they then extending that across the thousands and thousands of other podcasts on their platform, which I suppose they do have less control over, but do need to have policies in place when things like, false information about vaccines are being spread.
And indeed will all of this have a domino effect on other streaming services and the content that they stream. For people who don't know Joe Rogan, tell us a little bit more about him and the comments made by Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. What do you make of those comments in relation to the content on his podcast?
Well, Joe Rogan is one of, if not the most successful podcaster in the world, obviously based out of the US, initially built his audience through YouTube and other podcast platforms. And then when Spotify decided that as well as being the leading premium streaming music service, it also wanted to be a big player in podcasts, they started saying, well, how do you become the major player in podcasts? You sign up the major podcaster, and that's what they did. Neil Young's letter, which you mentioned, that was published earlier in the week, was a direct response to an earlier letter that came out earlier this month, signed by over 250, mainly American doctors and scientists, who were outright criticizing Joe Rogan and Spotify for not having proper policies in place for dealing with misinformation. Spotify say they do have content policies, but clearly not enough to satisfy these experts, these scientists and these medics. So Neil Young was directly responding to that letter. I think we probably will see, and we are already seeing on social media, a number of other mainly older artists stepping forward. To what extent that will have a massive impact on Spotify, I think it's if the big newer artists were to come on board, then it would really ramp up.
Chris Cook.